Okay. Today is December 17th, 2017. We are in the third day of Hanukkah for this year, and we're going to be going over the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, Book 12, Chapter 11. Okay. And some other things as well. And we're going to ask the Heavenly Family for their intervention. Heavenly Family, we thank you so much for your hand of blessing upon us, each and every one of us on the call and those that will be listening later. I pray that you would open our minds and our hearts to understand just this history. There's so much to sort through, different accounts, so many names, and a period of time that has been kind of blacked out to most of us for various reasons, mainly because of the canon and just our own basically lack of investigation. So please forgive us for that and just help us to go forward. And thank you for all this food that you have for us. Lead us into all truth. In the name of the branch and sheep. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Well, I was just going to start off really quick, just giving a little bit more information about a couple things. These temples that are written in Josephus, I talked a little bit yesterday of the temple that Onias allegedly built at Heliopolis, Egypt. And again, the only accounts of this temple are in the works of Josephus, but there is archaeological evidence for such a temple. So it's very interesting. There was sacrifices at this temple done. It looks like some of the evidence here may have been tampered with a little bit, but it does seem like there is some evidence anyway for there being a temple built by Onias in Egypt. And so now we read a little bit of it in Josephus, and now I was going to read just a little bit of it in the War of the Jews, which is another book by Josephus. It's War of the Jews, Book 7, Chapter 10.
How did you find that, Mary?
Oh, just Wikipedia. Just Wikipedia. Just various Googling, researching, and finding some that there's, like I said, there's only two real places that speak of this temple, and actually three. One we just came across in Book 12. And then he says he's going to talk about it more later at an appropriate time, and that is Book 13, and then again in War of the Jews. And so this is kind of an interesting story. Another thing that kind of gets brought up here is the Sicarii, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sicarii. I wasn't really familiar with it at all, except for that Caesar's Messiah book. Caesar's Messiah talks about the Sicarii a little bit, and the only place the Sicarii are spoken of also is Josephus. And I was going to skip over the Sicarii part. They are supposedly rebels, kind of associated with the Zealots, from this kind of time period here, kind of like, kind of offshoots from the Maccabees, it sounds like a little bit. This time period, we have so much to learn about it, as I'm finding out. It kind of overlaps the teacher of righteousness and the community at Qumran, that time period, the Hasmonean dynasty, and then goes into the Herodian dynasty, and we'll talk about that after Ed does his recap too. But in, let's see. So I'll start with War of the Jews. I'm going to start in chapter, Book 7, Chapter 10, Paragraph 2. Now Lupus did then govern Alexandria, who presently sent Caesar word of this commotion, who was having in suspicion the restless temper of the Jews for innovation, and being afraid lest they should get together again and persuade some others to join with them, gave orders to Lupus to demolish that Jewish temple which had been in the region called Onion. Looks like onion, but I'm imagining it's named after Onias, and was in Egypt, which was built and had its denomination from the occasion following Onias, the son of Simon, one of the Jewish high priests, who fled from Antiochus, king of Syria, when he made war with the Jews, and he came to Alexandria. And as Ptolemy received him very kindly on account of hatred of Antiochus, he assured him that if he would comply with his proposal, he would bring all the Jews to his assistance. And when the king agreed to do it so far as he was able, he desired to give him leave to build a temple somewhere in Egypt and to worship God according to the customs of his own country, for that the Jews would then be so much readier to fight against Antiochus, who had laid waste to the temple at Jerusalem. And they would then come with him greater goodwill, and that by granting them liberty of conscience, very many of them would come over to him. So Ptolemy complied with his proposals and gave him a place of 180 furlongs distance from Memphis that was called the Nomos of Heliopolis, where Onias built a fortress and a temple, not like that at Jerusalem, but such as resembled a tower. He built it of large stones to the height of 60 cubits. He made the structure of the altar in imitation of that in our own country, and in like manner adorned with gifts, excepting the make of the candlestick, for he did not make a candlestick, but had a single lamp hammered out of a piece of gold, which illuminated the place with its rays, and which he hung by a chain of gold. But the entire temple was encompassed with a wall of burnt brick, though it had gates of stone. The king also gave him a large country for revenue in money, that both the priests might have plentiful provisions made for them, and that God might have great abundance of what things were necessary for his worship. Yet did not Onias do this out of sober disposition, but he had a mind to contend with the Jews at Jerusalem, and could not forget the indignation he had for being banished thence. Accordingly, he thought that by building this temple he should draw away a great number from them to himself. There had been also a certain ancient prediction made by a prophet whose name was Isaiah, about 600 years before, that this temple should be built by a man that was a Jew in Egypt. And this is the history of the building of that temple. And then it talks about, he goes, now in Lupus, the governor of Alexandria, Egypt, upon the receipt of Caesar's letter, came to the temple and carried out of it some of the donations dedicated thereto, and shut up the temple itself. As Lupus died, a little afterward, Paulinus succeeded him. This man left none of those donations there, and threatened the priests severely if they did not bring them all out, nor did he permit any who were desirous of worshiping God there so much as to come near the whole sacred place. But when he had shut up the gates, he made it entirely inaccessible, insomuch as there remained no longer the least footsteps of any divine worship that had been in that place. Now the duration of the time for the building of this temple till it was shut up again was 343 years, and scholars correct that to 243 years. So it seemed as though that was taken down in around something like 66 BC. That was shut down. Like I said, I have archaeological information about that, though, which is very intriguing. And then the last thing I was going to say about the temples, there's another temple that's talked about in Josephus. It's the temple at Gerizim. It's the one in Samaria, which that's a little bit interesting to study too. But in studying about this temple that Onias built, I had mentioned the other day that I came across this temple that was in Elephantine, Egypt as well. They've also found archaeology for that, and they know about this because of a papyri that they found. I think they found this papyri. The excavation of this Jewish colony was in 1967. I'm trying to find when the papyri was found. But, I mean, fairly recent within modern history. But the interesting thing about this papyri describing this temple, I'll read it here. It says, the papyri suggests that even in exile and beyond, the veneration of a female deity endured. The texts were written by a group of Jews living at Elephantine near the Nubian border, whose religion had been described as nearly identical to Iron Age II Judahite religion. The papyri describes the Jews as worshiping Anat Yahu. Anat Yahu is described as either the wife of Yahweh or as a hypostatized aspect of Yahweh. And so that kind of goes along with the new moon call we had, I think the last new moon, where we were finding all these, pre-Canaanite examples of God and his wife also being worshipped as goddess. And this is one of those papyri where the Jews were absolutely doing that, although in Egypt. I just thought that was interesting. And so I will hand it off now over to Ed so he can recap last night's call.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is recap Josephus 12, book 12, chapter 9, chapter 10. And that actually started off with Demetrius, who was the son of Seleucus, fleeing from Rome, and he conquered Tripoli, which is a city in Syria, and he assumed the Seleucid crown. So he kind of like self-proclaimed himself to be king of the Greeks. And he gathered mercenary soldiers. He was really well received by the kingdom. Everyone accepted him. And Antiochus, who remember, he's the young king. He was 9 years old when he became king. He's about 11 at this point. He and his general, Lysias, were both captured. They were captured alive, and they were taken to Demetrius, and they were immediately slain. So that was the end of Antiochus's reign. It was only 2 years, and like I said, he was only 11 years old. So now we have a new king, which is this Demetrius. Okay, so then we also have Alchemist, the Jewish high priest, and many of the Jewish renegades. They joined allegiance with Demetrius, and they right away started accusing Judas and the law-keeping Jews of tormenting them and slaying them, and basically claiming that they were against the Hellenistic beliefs and everything, and that anyone that had any kind of Hellenistic beliefs were tormented or slain, and that they were forcing them to go to foreign lands, outside of Jerusalem and outside of Judah. So Demetrius immediately was very angry about this, and he sent his general Bacchides with an army, and along with Alchemist, to slay Judas and those with him. So here we go again. We've got another group of people that are against Judas. So Bacchides tried to make a league of friendship deceitfully with Judas, and Judas saw right through that, realizing that Bacchides has this tremendous army with him. So it's like, why would you come to make a league of agreement with me when you have an army behind you? So he knew that he came with the intention of war. However, some of the other, the Jews that were following Judas were kind of enticed by this whole idea of peace, and they also hadn't realized how Hellenized Alchemist had become, the high priest, and they kind of sided for a while with Bacchides, and this caused a little bit of a problem for Judas. However, very quickly, Bacchides showed his true colors. He ignored his oath, and he slew, it says 70 of them, which would be 60, I guess. So he slew 60 of these Hellenistic Jews, basically, causing the remaining good Jews to realize that Judas was right, to no longer trust either Bacchides or alchemy, and they remained with Judas. So Bacchides slew, started slaying more of the deserters at this point, forcing them to have allegiance to Alchemist. Alchemist was left with an army, and Bacchides ends up returning to Demetrius in Antioch. So now we've got Alchemist. He's at the temple, and he's got an army of Greek soldiers or Seleucid soldiers from Demetrius, and then Demetrius is now back in Antioch. And Alchemist was kind of told to just kind of hang out and just keep the peace there. That's why he has the army. But he felt like he could have a greater grip of power and more security in that power if he were to befriend a multitude of people, and he decided to do that. So he's going around and he's using kind words and friendship and that kind of thing. He ends up gathering a lot of supporters, and mostly these are Hellenized, wicked Jews, and they were deserters of Judas and that kind of thing. And he ended up using these supporters both as servants and as an army to start slewing Judas's followers. So they're kind of going around town, villages and so on, and picking off Judas's supporters. So Judas's response was to begin an assault on Alchemus's party, and so Alchemus ends up realizing that he's still no match for Judas, and he ends up going back to Demetrius in Antioch. He goes back to Antioch where Demetrius is at and asks for additional help, more troops and so on. And again, he kind of smears Judas's name, talks about how he's agitating all of the Greeks, in fact, which is really not what he was doing. He was agitating and killing the Jews that had broken away. But anyway, Demetrius ends up sending another general named Nicanor against Judas with a great army and orders to destroy all in the nation of Judah. Turns out that army, actually I'm not exactly sure of that because another army joins in it. At the end, it ends up being 9,000 men that Nicanor had fighting against Judas. And he's actually called to destroy the entire nation of Judah. So Nicanor seems to be a common thing in the Seleucid army. Nicanor decides that he's going to try trickery and form kind of a fake peace treatise with Judas in the name of Demetrius. So he's kind of saying like, hey, Demetrius and I, we want to form a peaceful relationship with the Jews, and which was just trickery. It was a way to kind of relax everything so that they can then attack. So at first, Judas was compelled by this, and but he soon suspected that something was up, and he ended up running to the security of his soldiers. So he was kind of set aside in a meeting with Nicanor, and realizing Nicanor had given a hand signal, I believe, and a bunch of his soldiers started to come to attack Judas. Judas catches on to what's going, runs into the security of his own soldiers, and they all end up retreating. Nicanor ends up making open war at that point with Judas in a village called Capharsalama, where he ends up. So in the account of Josephus here, we have Josephus saying that he defeats Judas, but we quickly learn that really Nicanor got defeated because of the account. The next sentences and everything revealed that it was obvious that it was Nicanor that was defeated. So Nicanor. And if you go to the footnote, you can see that correction. We had talked about that last night, of course. So anyway, Nicanor has a small defeat there, and he ends up fleeing to Jerusalem, to the citadel. The citadel was kind of an embattlement or whatever, very close to the temple, and probably there to protect the temple. But he ends up going to the citadel, and you end up having the people, Judas's good priests who are coming to make sacrifices and so on, along with Alchemus, who is the high priest in that temple. There were probably some Hellenistic priests there as well. But anyway, Nicanor ends up coming down from the citadel to the temple, and he ends up blaspheming God, and he ends up making threats to the temple priests and the elders unless they give up Judas. So basically he's saying, I'm going to completely destroy this temple unless you guys give me Judas. Let me know what's going on with him, or tell me where he's at, or deliver him to me, or whatever. So anyway, Nicanor ends up leaving Jerusalem. He sets up in a camp outside of Jerusalem called Betharon, or the village was called Betharon, and there he was joined by another army of supporters from Syria. So now we have Nicanor and this army from Demetrius, as well as another army of supporters from Syria in this town of Betharon. And then Judas, in the meantime, so at this point we have Nicanor with a total number of troops of 9,000. So he's got 9,000 men. Judas is about 3.5 miles away, 3.75 actually. It says he was 30 furlongs away from where Nicanor and his army was. He was in a village called Adasa. And anyway, he has 1,000 soldiers in his army. And so he needed to give them some encouragement, realizing that they were outnumbered 9-1. So he ends up reminding them, again, there's sort of this history of the Jewish generals giving these sort of pep talks, pep rallies before they go to war. And here we are again with another pep rally. And he's telling them, reminding them of who they are, the great rewards that they fight for, reminding them of the courageous battles that they've won in the past and how they've been outnumbered in the past and so on. And actually, I found in 2 Maccabees chapter 15, verses 15 through 16, there's an account talking about this exact same speech. And in this, the night before, he had a vision from the prophet Jeremiah, and in this vision, the prophet Jeremiah is handing Judas a golden sword. So that, in his mind, was like a
good omen.
A good omen, yeah. And that, in the account of Maccabees, that ends up being a great encouragement to his 1,000 soldiers. So they were really, like feeling like they were going to win this battle. They had the upper hand because of this vision that Judah had. Again, that is not in the Josephus account. I found that aside from the Josephus account. Okay, so anyway, they end up going into battle. Actually, Judas ends up attacking. He was the one that first went on the attack. And it was a great, severe battle, and it resulted in Judas overcoming the enemy and killing Nicanor. And when he killed Nicanor, just like we see so often, the rest of the soldiers with their general down, they throw their weapons down, they start to retreat, and Nicanor's people they're fleeing from where they're at, running out into the villages. Judas's army follows them. They slew them along the way, and then Judas gave notice to the neighboring villages of his triumph by trumpet blasts, and or his victory over Nicanor. And the villagers all got excited, realizing that the Jews had won, and they took up their arms, put on their, any kind of armor they had and so on. And as Nicanor's army was rushing through their villages, they would attack them and kill them. So it ended up resulting in every single man, all 9,000, perished. So Judas's army of 1,000 totally destroyed, along with the help of these villagers, 9,000 of Nicanor and his army. And that then we get into this proclamation of a day of celebration to be kept forever, a festival day. People call that day Yom Nicanor or Nicanor Day. A lot of it looks like when you look at the Jewish holidays, that one generally doesn't pop up. It's the 13th day of the 12th month, or the 13th day of Adar. And what ended up happening, it looks like, is that Purim, which we know about, kind of absorbed it. And interestingly, the day that where the Jews, Purim was in the 4th century BCE, so it occurred quite a bit earlier than Nicanor Day. But it was also a day where the Jews were spared. And it's interestingly, the day coincides. So we have the 13th day of Adar was Nicanor Day, and on the 13th day of Adar was when the Jews were allowed from the Persian Empire. They had command, because the whole story of Esther and everything, but they were allowed to defend themselves and they actually, instead of this decree that would eliminate all the Jews, they were instead given permission to defend themselves, and they started to have some great victories. That first victory that set the stage for them to survive and hold their own with the Persians was Adar 13, the same day. So here we have, if Nicanor could have easily defeated, you could have a reasonable expectation that Nicanor would have defeated them with his, 9-1 outnumbering. But the Jews hang on that same day. A few centuries earlier, that same kind of situation was going on. It could have easily been the end of the Jewish nation or the Jewish people, and yet they were spared by kind of a miraculous event. So, but anyway, Purim is celebrated fairly regularly by Jewish people, and Nicanor Day is kind of forgotten or overshadowed by Purim. And by the way, Purim is the 14th day of the month, and they celebrate the day that they rested. So they slew some enemy, and then on the 14th, they rested. So that's why Purim is on the 14th and not the 13th. So anyway, and another big thing about Nicanor Day is that why that was a decree to celebrate for all time is that the Jews had a period with no wars. They actually had a period of peace, which really couldn't have lasted too long because as we read on here, we're right back into wars. But they had some kind of a period of peace where nobody was, trying to attack them or whatever after that defeat of Nicanor. Okay, so moving on. All right, so Alchemist, while all this is going on, Alchemist is resolving to pull down the sanctuary wall. Okay, so Alchemist wasn't happy about this defeat at Nicanor. Obviously. He's the one that enticed Demetrius to send Nicanor and his army and to defeat Judas. So Alchemist is he's the high priest. He's a Hellenistic high priest. He's very upset about the defeat of Nicanor, and he ends up going to the temple, and he's telling them that he and his remaining soldiers are going to tear down the sanctuary wall. And while that was happening, he was smitten with a stroke. And actually, Josephus claims he was smitten by God with a stroke. He fell to the ground speechless and then died after many tormenting days. So, in Josephus's account, the high priest Alchemist ends up dying of a stroke, and he has Judas becoming the high priest. And then we have a footnote in that chapter that shows us that this account actually directly contradicts what's in 1 Maccabees 9:54 through 57, which has actually Alchemist dying after Judas's death. So Judas died before Alchemist, so there's no way Judas could have ended up being the high priest, because he would have died first. And there's no account anywhere else of Judas being the high priest. So that's just an interesting footnote. But we're studying the history as Josephus lays it out, so we're going to just kind of have to carry on with this theme that Judas is now the high priest. Okay, so Judas. So we're about to start getting into the Romans now, and while all this was going on, the Romans were fighting battles and having great victories. They were taking over a lot of the Seleucid lands and everything. So we have the Romans kind of coming into power. And Judas understands this. He sees the power of them and their great conquests, and is happy about having a little bit of rest right now, right? After the defeat of Nicanor, and he resolves to enter into a league of friendship with them. So he understands the benefit of allying with the Romans. He's had all this Hellenistic problem, and now he's going to ally with the Romans. So he actually goes to Rome and works out, talks to the leaders there, to the Senate actually, and actually Rome's Senate ends up working out a decree, which I'm going to go ahead and read, if I can find it. Okay, this is the decree that came down from Rome towards the Jews. The decree itself was this: the decree of the Senate concerning a league of assistance and friendship with the nation of the Jews. It shall not be lawful for any that are subject to the Romans to make war with the nation of the Jews, nor to assist those that do so, either by sending them corn or ships or money. And if any attack be made upon the Jews, the Romans shall assist them, as far as they are able. And again, if any attack be made upon the Romans, the Jews shall assist them. And if the Jews have a mind to add to or to take away anything from this league of assistance, that shall be done with the common consent of the Romans. And whatever additions shall be thus made, it shall be of force. So here we have this decree being made. Judas is now, the Jews are now befriended, and I should say the non-Hellenistic Jews are now befriended with the Roman Empire that's starting up. I mean, I wouldn't call it an empire yet, but and if you think about this decree, it actually kind of protects the Jews from Demetrius, from the Seleucid king. Because if by this decree, if Demetrius attacks Judas, well, the Romans are going to assist. So this would make Demetrius uneasy, right? And so anyway, that's where we're at right now. Chapter 10 ends with Judas as the high priest, and his brother Simon is the general of the army. So that's the ending of chapter 10. Mary was going to talk for just a minute. I forget about what. But
the great mystery of who is this next high priest.
Oh, right.
What is up with that? Because we looked a little bit about this at the end of last night's call, and we're just noticing some conflicts. Obviously, Josephus here says it's Judas. Then in Book 20 of Jewish Antiquities, Josephus says that the office was left empty for 7 years, which scholars think is unlikely. And then, of course, Maccabees said that it doesn't say that it was Judas and that he had died before Alchemists by 1 year, so that's not possible. So there's this, in scholarship, this phrase called inter sacerdotem, meaning what happened in this interim period, who was the priest here? Because it does look like these high priests that Jonathan from 153 to 143 BC did become the next high priest starting the Hasmonean dynasty. And so all these, Jonathan, of course, was Judas's brother, son of Mattathias. And then the next high priest was Simon, which was Jonathan's brother. And then we're getting all down to the next son, the next son, the next son, the next son. So all the sons, down from Mattathias, Judas, Jonathan, that is the Hasmonean dynasty. And so the Hasmonean dynasty of high priests starts in 153 BC and ends in 37 BC when the Herodian Roman period takes over at that point. So the big question is, though, who succeeded Alchemists? And it eventually was Jonathan, but there's this gap. And we had looked a little bit at Alchemists last night and saw that successor as high priest is unknown, though some scholars suggest that it was the teacher of righteousness, the later founder of the Essenes. So that's very compelling and very interesting, so I had to look into that a little bit, actually a lot, and here is what I found. That, and believe me, not like I've cracked any big case because I haven't, but there's this this thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're called, actually, hold on a second, this phrase that I had never heard of before, if I can find it. Well, this phrase basically means that there's these people in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are giving commentaries on Isaiah, commentaries on Habakkuk. Oh, Pesher. These are called Peshers, and they are giving commentaries, kind of like the Matthew Henry commentary of the whole Bible. That's what these guys were. And it looks like these Peshers, or commentators on Habakkuk in particular, were kind of, like maybe towards the end, during the 1st century BCE. So that last 100 years before the time of Christ was when these guys were giving commentary. And they talk about, in these commentaries of Habakkuk, these guys called the wicked priests. And they are paralleling these wicked priests with the teacher of righteousness. And so these Peshers think that they have got some, like here's the reading basically of Habakkuk, and then they're going to tell you what it really means. So they've got like this inside hidden knowledge on what Habakkuk means. And it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I looked it up. And sure enough, here's an example in Habakkuk of what these commentators say. And this is 1QP HAB, which is just called a commentary on Habakkuk. And the statement in Habakkuk is, for the wicked encompass the righteous. And then the commentator says, the wicked is the wicked priest, and the righteous is the teacher of righteousness. And he says this 4 times. He says it in his commentary on Psalm 37 as well, that there was this problem between the wicked priests and the teacher of righteousness. So some people think that the teacher of righteousness was, who nobody knows who this is, was the one who took over from alchemists, possibly, or he was, they called him like a schism type of priest, that he was somehow obtained a priestly status, not necessarily in the general way, whoever appoints the high priest. Actually, I don't even know who does that. But let's see, it says here, the wicked priests, let me see, so this is called a sobriquet, which is sort of like a pet name that you would have, like a sobriquet for New York City would be the Big Apple. So these wicked priests are coming up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Persham 4 times is used in Habakkuk commentary and once in the commentary of Psalms to refer to an opponent of the teacher of righteousness. It has been suggested that the phrase is a pun on the meaning high priest, but it's not the proper term for high priest. He's generally identified with the Hasmonean Maccabean high priest or priest. However, his exact identification remains controversial and has been called one of the knottiest problems connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The most commonly argued for single candidate for this wicked priest is Jonathan Maccabeus, followed by Simon Maccabeus. The widespread acceptance of this view, despite its acknowledged weakness, has been dubbed the Jonathan consensus. More recently, some scholars have argued that the sobriquet does not refer only to one individual. Most notably, there's one hypothesis advanced by Garcia Martinez and van der Wood that there are 6 wicked priests. And so some people think that these wicked priests referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls are the Hasmonean priests or the Maccabean priests. So I don't know if, let's see, the references to the wicked priests have been divided into 3 overlapping themes: violence against the teacher of righteousness and his followers, cultic transgression and non-observance, or just basically doing the sanctuary service completely wrong, and following the wrong calendar and all of that, and then divine punishment against the wicked priests for these acts. Many scholars have gleaned from this passage that the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness follow different liturgical calendars, thus enabling the wicked priest to travel on Yom Kippur. Some have even suggested that the teacher of righteousness was a schismatic high priest during the pre-Jonathan intersacerdotum period. So some people think that maybe the teacher of righteousness was thrown out by Jonathan. Several scholars have interpreted the sobriquet of wicked priests as meaning illegitimate priests, not of the Zadokite lineage. some interpret 1Q Habakkuk that the wicked priest was called by the name of the truth when he first arose, as the initial acceptance of the wicked priest by the Qumran community before Jonathan combined the diarchy, which is the kingship and the priesthood, and this other hypothesis follows this interpretation based not on evidence from the Pershim, but rather from external sources, namely 1st and 2nd Maccabees and Josephus. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting that the teacher of righteousness is kind of, in scholarship anyway, coming on the stage because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That some people think that the teacher of righteousness was the next priest, although that's just seems like mostly anecdotal evidence. But again, we do see that there was this dichotomy between the Pershim of the Qumran community saying that there were some bad guys coming against the teacher of righteousness, and scholars think that it might be the Hasmonean Maccabean priests. So who knows? Anyway, I thought that was interesting.
It seems, that's definitely contrary to Josephus. The way that he's talking about the Hasmonean priests, they're the ones that are following God. They're the ones that are with Mattathias' teachings and so on. So that is interesting. Okay, so getting back to Josephus now, we're going to start to read chapter 11. A couple things to be thinking about. One, we've got, again, the Jews are being supported, and the treaty has probably really upset Demetrius. So we would expect some kind of a reaction from Demetrius, who's the Seleucid leader. And the other thing, sort of sadly, we're in the last chapter of Book 12. And if you guys remember when we started the Book 12, there's sort of a little preamble to it, very short preamble, and that says, from the death of Alexander the Great to the death of Judas Maccabeus. So the ending of Book 12 is the death of Judas Maccabeus. So we're going to expect that in chapter 11, we're going to run into Judas Maccabeus' death, who, I don't know about you guys, but that's kind of sad. Sort of feeling like a brother at this point. We've been through all these battles with him and all these victories, and him kind of upholding God and Jewish tradition and Jewish laws and fighting against the Hellenization of his people, right? So here we go, chapter 11. Again, we're in Book 12, chapter 11. And the preamble to this chapter is that Bacchides was again sent out against Judas. Oh, there we go. And how Judas fell as he was courageously fighting. So here we go, chapter 1. But when Demetrius was informed of the death of Nicanor and the destruction of the army that was with him, he sent Bacchides again with an army to Judea, who marched out of Antioch and came to Judea and pitched his camp at Arbela, a city of Galilee, and having besieged and taken those that were in caves, for many of the people fled into such places, he removed and made all the haste he could to Jerusalem. And when he had learned that Judas had pitched his camp at a certain village whose name was Beth-Zetho, he led his army against him, and they were 20,000 footmen and 2,000 horsemen. Now Judas had no more soldiers than 1,000. When these saw the multitude of Bacchides' men, they were afraid and left their camp and fled away, excepting 800. Okay, so obviously 200 of them have fled away out of fear. Judas is left with 200 against 20,000. Now when Judas was deserted by his own soldiers, and the enemy pressed upon him and gave him no time to gather his army together, he was disposed to fight with Bacchides' army, though he had but 800 men with him. So he exhorted these men to undergo the danger courageously and encouraged them to attack the enemy. And when they said they were not a body sufficient to fight so great an army, and advised that they should retire now and save themselves, and that when he had gathered his own men together, then he'd fall upon the enemy afterward. His answer was this: let not the sun ever see such a thing, that I should show my back to the enemy. And although this be the time that will bring me to my end, and I must die in this battle, I will rather stand to it courageously and bear whatsoever comes upon me, than by now running away, bringing reproach upon my former great actions, or tarnish their glory. This was the speech he made to those that remained with him, and whereby he encouraged them to attack the enemy. Okay, that's the end of paragraph 1.
I want to read footnote 29.
Go ahead. I don't have the numbers.
Yeah, okay. It's that this copy of Josephus, as he wrote it, had here not 1,000 but 3,000, with 1 Maccabees 9:5 is very plain, because though the main part ran away at first, even in Josephus as well as in 1 Maccabees 9:6, yet as there, so here, 800 are said to have remained with Judas, which would be absurd if the whole number had been no more than 1,000. He's just saying most likely it was 3,000 down to 800.
Okay, so obviously it almost is irrelevant because they're going up against 20,000. So here we go again. Judas is greatly outnumbered, and there he is again giving his pep speech, right? So is there any comments on this paragraph? Kind of really
beautiful.
Speaks for itself. I'm sorry, what did you say, Leroy?
Say beautiful.
Well, this is going to be the end of Judas Maccabeus, unfortunately, though. Okay.
You didn't die a coward, though. Or he didn't die a coward.
Right, that's right. Yep. Yeah, he ended courageously. Okay, so we'll get into paragraph 2. But Bacchides drew his army out of their camp and put them in array for the battle. He set the horsemen on both the wings, and the light soldiers and the archers he placed before the whole army, but he himself was on the right wing. And when he had thus put his army in order for battle, and was going to join battle with the enemy, he commanded the trumpeter to give a signal of battle, and the army to make a shout, and to fall on the enemy. And when Judas had done the same, he joined battle with them. And as both sides fought valiantly, and the battle continued till sunset, Judas saw that Bacchides and the strongest part of the army was on the right wing. And thereupon took the most courageous men with him, and ran upon that part of the army, and fell upon those that were there, and broke their ranks, and drove them into the middle, and forced them to run away, and pursued them as far as to a mountain called Azza. But when those of the left wing saw that the right wing was put to flight, they encompassed Judah, and pursued him, and came behind him, and took him into the middle of their army. So not being able to fly, but he and those that were with him fought, and when they had slain a great many of those who came against him, he at last was himself wounded, and fell, and gave up the ghost, and died in a way like to his former famous actions. When Judas was dead, those that were with him had no one whom they could regard as their commander, but when they saw themselves deprived of such a general, they fled. But Simon and Jonathan, Judah's brethren, that's his brothers, received his dead body by a treaty from the enemy, and carried it to the village Modin. Modin is, actually it's going to say that. Okay, Modin, where their father had been buried, and there buried him, while the multitude lamented him many days, and performed the usual solemn rites of a funeral to him. And this was the end of Judas to come. He had been a man of valor and a great warrior, and mindful of all the commands of their father Mattathias, and had undergone all difficulties, both in doing and suffering, for the liberty of his countrymen. And when his character was so excellent while he was alive, he left behind him a glorious reputation and memorial, by gaining freedom for his nation and delivering them from slavery under the Macedonians, And when he had retained the high priesthood 3 years, he died. So again, we have him, this is the end of Book 12, and that's how Book 12, was going to end, with the death of Judas Maccabeus. And we have Josephus saying again that he was the high priest at this point. So it'll be interesting when we move into Book 13 to see who Josephus claims will be the high priest after Judas. So anyway, are there any questions or comments on paragraph 2?
Thank you for,
anyone else? So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Say, thank you for doing all that studying. That is very interesting.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Actually, it was fun. Do you guys have the same kind of, like I literally felt some sorrow, like losing Judas here. Just curious if anyone else kind of had that same thing going on.
It's too bad that, he's fought other battles with, the lesser men, right? But this time, maybe it was way too much.
Yeah.
The ratio was too great.
Right.
800 to 20,000.
Right.
Apparently his time was come. He got the object done, that he got freedom for their people. So whether he died or not, he got the job done.
Absolutely right. So anyone else, any comments?
So did you say we're going to get into Book 13?
Yeah, I'm guessing we'll do Book 13. Actually, it's just interesting. I'm looking at Book 13, and the first comment on Chapter 1 is how Jonathan took the government after his brother Judas, and how he, together with his brother Simon, waged war against Maccabees. So Judas, obviously in Chapter 1, we're going to see them try to revenge the death of their brother against the general Maccabees of the Seleucid army. So, all right. Well, we've been on for an hour.
Yeah, so we'll wrap it up. If no one has any other comments, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
It's been a good hour.
Good. Yeah, it was interesting.
Dear Heavenly Family, please help us to have that kind of courage in our ranks. We give you our heart to that end. In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen. Thank you,
Leroy.
Amen.
Okay, well, Lila Tove, and we'll talk to you Tuesday night.
Sounds good.
All right,
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.